Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to share with you this script that I love called Engrosser script. Burning question. What is Engrosser script? So I have two exemplars up here on this slide. The first one is from the Universal Penman, which contains engraved exemplars from George Bickham. And the second book up there is the Zenarian Manual, which is the best book out there to study Engrosser script. And this is the same book that IAMPETH uses as a standard when they're judging in their certificate program. So the short answer is Engrosser script is American Roundhand. If I were to define it, I would say Engrosser script is a roundhand script executed with a pointed metal nib inserted into an oblique pen. I have slides about oblique pens later that we'll go over. So Engrosser script's parent script is the English roundhand, which was popular in the 1600s, 1700s. Engrosser script was developed 200 years later in the USA, so about late 1800s, early 1900s. At that time, the steel nibs and oblique pens were already invented. So these were the tools that were specifically used for Engrosser script. Whereas for English roundhand was historically executed with a narrowly cut, broad-edged quill pen. As a result, you can see here that Engrosser script has more thin to thick contrast. So what the American version takes from the English roundhand is that you have your shaded strokes there. It's a shaded script. You have thick downstrokes. The script has a cursive look. The letters are connected and they are both based on the oval shape. You can see how rounded the turns are, hence the term roundhand. Up next, I have here two exemplars that represent two excellent examples of Engrosser script from a couple of famous penmen at the time, Lupfer and Baird. One thing I'd like you to note here is there's a slight shading on the loops that we call accent shades. The purpose of this is to draw your eyes towards the loop and to add more balance to the hairline. Another name for Engrosser script is Engraver script. So I have here an illustration from Lupfer. The first arrow in this illustration points to where you lift your pen. So basically, we lift our pen after practically every stroke. We lift our pen on the baseline and at the top of that X height. This is a key detail in executing Engrosser script. American penmen at the time, when they were developing the script, they wanted precision and they wanted the same engraved look that metal engravers have when they're etching on plates. So they were copying how the engravers lifted their tool whenever they work on curves. For English roundhand, it was more of a handwriting style with a continuous flow. You would still lift your quill when you dip your ink, but for Engrosser script, you very consciously lift your pen after every stroke. So it's more akin to engraving on paper. Other arrows here show how the curved letters C, E, O, and A relate to the letter I. When you complete the shade, you see the arrows at the top left. When you complete that negative space there, the letter turns into an I. So this demonstrates how replicable the strokes are. You can break down the script into its smallest component and find those components repeated consistently across the script. It provides a more precise method in learning and writing the script because you pay that level of attention to detail. In that sense, Engrosser script is pretty modular. The downside of which is that it's a slower script to execute. What does engross mean? So to engross is to prepare a document in its final or official form, and it's usually written in large letters. Engrossers refer to professional document designers that had multiple hands or scripts in their toolbox in their practice. They would use Engrosser script in the bodies of certificates, diplomas, and resolutions. The large text you see here on the second photo was executed in broad edge, and it provides contrast between the block letters and the cursive script. So now we've touched on the difference in tool, quill versus oblique, steel nib, and execution, wherein it's more handwriting versus engraving on paper. In the next few slides, I want to discuss the visual differences between these two scripts. So I have here the example word is honorable. I've taken it from the two books I've mentioned before. The first one was engraved by Bickham and the second was written by Baird. I've blown them up into the same X height. And let's set aside the obvious differences of capitalization, spelling, slant, and the loops on L and B and H. And I want to study a few more details to help us discern the differences between these two scripts, between the parent and the child script. I want you to pay attention to the top and bottom turns of this word. For Engrosser script at the bottom, the shades stop at the baseline or just before the baseline. And that's because one, you lift at every turn, and two, you are using a metal nib, a pointed nib, which only produces shades on downstrokes. It cannot carry shades on upstrokes. At the top here, you see the shades appear to carry a little bit farther through the baseline or a little bit earlier at the top line here. And that's because quill pens work differently from flexible nibs. They can create some thickness on other strokes other than the downstrokes. I also want you to look at how much the stroke travels or sits on the baseline and at the top line versus in Engrosser script, where once you replace your pen here, you pretty much go up right away, versus here in English Roundhand, there's a much rounder and softer look. So as a result, for Engrosser script, it has more angular turns at the top and the bottom here. So it applies to both top and bottom curves. But overall, it still retains that roundhand look. The second thing I want to point out is the connection and the negative spaces between these two scripts. For English Roundhand, there tends to be a tighter connection and a smaller negative space. That's because the hairlines connect or branch very close to the shade before it, as opposed to here in Engrosser script. You see the word looks more stretched out because the hairlines are expressed more openly and they go slightly farther away versus where English Roundhand would have stopped. The last thing I want to point out as a difference is that I want you to look at these yellow shaded areas. They are the oval shapes inside your closed oval letters like O and A. For English Roundhand, you see that the elliptical shape inside is pretty much reserved still. But for Engrosser script, because of the way that they execute the shades, wherein they keep the right side pretty much straight, even for curved letters. Remember that slide before where you can turn O to an I. So because of that, it modifies the interior shape of your ovals here. It's not quite symmetrical or elliptical anymore. So here's a summary of all 3 points. And here's another example. Same penman, Bickham and Baird. I've blown the word company to the same X height, and they happen to be on the same slant as well. So you'll notice how much wider Engrosser script is. And you see that for Engrosser script, the shades stop at the baseline. The turns are more angular. There's more negative spaces between the strokes, and the interior shape of your oval is cut off. Here's a comparison of long texts between these two penmen. Okay, so a question you might have at this point is, what is copperplate script? So the term copperplate originates from the intaglio printing method, wherein the designs are etched into a copper surface so that the ink is printed only from the recessed part of the plate. Copperplate script is an umbrella term covering various roundhand styles, typically with shaded strokes. Copperplate can also be written in monoline, that's why I say typically. So English Roundhand and Engrosser script both belong under the copperplate umbrella, and you can both call them copperplate. And I have examples here of our modern copperplate scripts today. When you look at them, you can somewhat identify which style their copperplate is more influenced by. Is it more the English roundhand or the American roundhand, or is it somewhere in between? In terms of execution, most of these scripts that we call Copperplate today would not use the frequent pen lifting technique specific to Engrosser script because it makes your writing much slower. And yeah, that's because when Engrosser script was being developed, they placed a lot of importance on precision, deliberation, and consistency because this was used on formal documents. It's important that it's very legible. But nowadays, we have other uses for this sort of script, and it's usually less formal. Nowadays, Copperplate, when we think of it, it's a script that forgoes breaking down the stroke into the same granular level as Engrosser script does, allowing you to write it faster. Ultimately, these are all Copperplate, and the choice depends on your desired look and preferred execution style. I would choose Engrosser script if you like that classic, consistent, refined look, wherein it's very consistent, the strokes are repeatable, and it's very symmetrical and yeah, refined, classic. You might be curious as to how Engrosser script or Copperplate compares against other popular pointed pen scripts. Not going to go through all of them, but I've placed 6 different scripts here on the slide, namely Italian Hand on the first row, Italian Hand, Spencerian script, business penmanship right there in the middle, and then second row, ornamental penmanship, signwriter's script, which is basically shaded Spencerian, and then Madura's script. When studying them, I would pay attention to where the shades are. Are they on every downstroke? Where are they located? How thick are the shades? What kind of oval do your letters follow? What kind of turns do you do? Are they more on the rounder side or on the angular side? Okay, now let's proceed with talking about the tools. I have here on the screen nibs, oblique pen holders, ink choices, and paper choices. For nibs, there's so many different brands out there. They differ by flexibility and sharpness. The more flexible a nib is, the thicker you can make your shades. For heavy hands, I would recommend G nibs, but just note like G nibs like Nico G, Zebra G, Tachikawa G, but just note that it could strain your hand faster because it is stiff. I personally like Hunt 22B, which I feel has that just right flexed. For the other popular nibs out there, there's Hunt 101, Gillot 303, and Leonard Principal extra fine. For oblique pen holders, I always recommend Yoke Pen's the Deuce dual pen holder because you can transform it between straight and oblique. I specifically buy lightweight wooden pens as the ones on the picture because I find them more comfortable to use and I can write for longer. For inks, there's also many choices out there. My personal favorite is Tom Norton's walnut ink because it requires no preparation. It's good to go right out of the bottle as opposed to getting walnut crystals that you have to dissolve or sumi ink that you would most likely need to dilute, and it typically doesn't give as fine hairlines as other inks would. Like for example, Iron Gall does give you very fine hairlines. The only thing with Iron Gall is that they might wear out your nibs faster because of how acidic they are, especially if you don't clean your nib after using these ink. There's also acrylic inks out there. Dr. PH Martin's iridescent ink is a popular one. There's gouache, fine tech, poster colors, bleed proof white. These ones you need to mix it up with water up to a milky consistency before you're able to write them with your pointed nib. For paper, other brands that I have here on the screen are Rhodia, Maruman, Borden and Riley, and Fabriano. Let's go over the nib anatomy very quickly here. So the tip is pointed and it allows for thin hairlines. You have a slit right here in the middle and it splits the nib into 2 tines, which I've labeled here in pink and turquoise, and it allows you to create the shades. And like I mentioned, the shades will be as thick as how much you spread the 2 tines apart. The shoulder allows your nibs to flex on the page. There's a vent hole here, which prevents your nib from cracking as you flex it or split it. And then the body, this is the part that you insert in your pen, and then note that when you're creating shades, you always want to be pulling down towards the base. You want to be pulling down in this direction. So nibs, when they're new, they are coated with oil to prevent rusting. So before use, it's imperative that you clean it first. Otherwise, the ink is not going to flow properly. Ideally, when you dip your nib in ink, it gets coated completely like this one here with a star. And also note, when you dip it, you dip up to the vent hole. You don't need to dip all the way because it's going to make your pen holder wet. I have listed here several methods of how to clean your nibs. My personal go-to is to wipe it with isopropyl alcohol. I would just do it repeatedly if it doesn't work, or you could do a combination of the other things here. You can wipe it with Windex, gum arabic. You can even use your spit. You can wash it with dish soap or use a solution containing lemon vinegar and dish soap. You can use toothpaste and then gently brush it, or you can also stick it in a potato because the potato absorbs the oil out of the nib. Next, talk about pen holders. So I have a picture here of the straight pen holder and how a left-hand calligrapher versus a right-hand calligrapher might use it. It's pretty straightforward how to insert the nib. You just practically insert it at the very tip, and then while you can write slanted scripts with it like Engrosser script, I personally find that it's not as comfortable as using oblique pens. You would have to adjust your hand and your wrist quite a bit to make sure your nib is writing according to the slant. Here's the anatomy of an oblique pen holder. There's an extra metal thing, which we call a flange, sticking out to the left side of the pen staff, and that's where you insert your nib. So this holder was invented exactly for writing slanted scripts. Here's a couple of sample photos of how the oblique pen looks when you're writing. I have a picture from a friend. She provided this to me and the other picture as well for left-hand calligraphers as an option of how to place your paper. And the other one is me using my right hand. Ideally, the body of your nib is in alignment with the slant of your script. You should also not be bending your wrist as you write. So what you would do is you would have to rotate your paper clockwise if you're a lefty or counterclockwise if you're left-handed. I personally sit sideways and I rotate the paper 90 degrees so that my whole forearm is resting comfortably on the table. I see you could also just angle it a little bit, but just make sure that your wrist is not bent and that the nib inside your pen is aligned with the same slant on the page. You always want to be pulling towards the base of your nib. So once you have your nib aligned to the slant, you should be pulling downwards in that same direction. That's the path of least resistance for your nib. I have a couple of pictures here from Dr. Vitolo wherein he illustrates that when you pull at a different angle than the base or the body of your nib, you can still create shades, but you might get these jagged edges on your shades. Final stretch here. Let's talk about oblique pen configurations and my personal preferred setup on the metal flange. First one is the tilt angle when you look at it sideways. In the middle picture here, you see that the nib is slightly steeper than your actual pen. What that does is you get more resistance from the nib flexing. If it's too low, the opposite might happen. You might get too much ink on the page. So what I like to do, or what I like to have on my pens, is just a slight lower angle compared to the pen staff. I find that it allows for a smoother experience in writing. If you happen to have a speedball oblique pen with a plastic flange, you cannot adjust the metal flange yourself. For these two, you can definitely use your fingers to adjust it and tilt it, but unfortunately for speedball holders like this, you can't. A workaround is you would just move your pen holder lower so that the whole pen angle is going to be lower to the page and you'll find less resistance from your nib. Another thing here is adjusting the cant of your flange. Both of these are fine, the first two pictures. You can adjust it. My suggestion is to adjust it slightly inward because this angle affects the flexibility and control of your tine. It allows for better control. For speedball, you unfortunately can't move it, but there's a circular groove on the other side of this picture of this holder or flange here, and you can just manually adjust your nib where you insert your nib so that it's canted to the right. And lastly, for balance, you want the tip of your nib to be aligned to the pen, the center of your pen. By having a metal flange here, you've dislodged the nib to an angle. So in order for it to feel more natural for you to write, you want to place the tip back to the center of your pen.